6 months had passed since that fateful day when Sarah was sent home for her hair. Riverside High looked different now, not just because of the new Celebrate Diversity mural in the main hallway, but because of the energy that filled its corridors. The new principal, Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, stood greeting students as they arrived for the first day of the new semester. His warm smile and genuine interest in each student marked a dramatic change from Walsh's cold authority. Today was special. It was Sarah's first day back at Riverside High. She walked up the same steps where she had once stood in tears. This time, she wasn't alone. Dozens of students wore their natural hairstyles proudly, some sporting traditional clothing from their cultures. The fear of being singled out had disappeared like morning mist in sunlight. "Welcome back, Sarah," Dr. Rodriguez said, extending his hand. Or should I say, Madam Student Representative. Sarah smiled, touching the silver pin on her lapel that marked her new role on the school board. Being the youngest board member in district history wasn't just an honor, it was a responsibility she took seriously. Inside, the changes were everywhere. The old dress code poster had been replaced with a new policy that celebrated cultural expression. Signs in multiple languages welcomed visitors. The trophy case now displayed not just sports achievements, but cultural celebration awards and diversity recognition. Emma, now head of the Student Journalism Club, was recording again, but this time for a documentary about positive change. "Can you believe it's only been 6 months?" she asked Sarah as they walked to first period together. Their friendship had grown stronger through everything that happened. In the teacher's lounge, Mrs. Rodriguez, no longer afraid of speaking up, led a morning discussion about cultural sensitivity in education. Teachers shared ideas for incorporating diverse perspectives into their lessons. The fear that had once silenced them had been replaced by enthusiastic collaboration. Sarah's first task of the day was meeting with the new Student Parent Advisory Committee. The group, created after Walsh's departure, reviewed disciplinary actions to ensure fairness. "Last semester," Sarah reported, "we had 0 complaints about cultural discrimination. That's a first in Riverside's history." The morning announcements, now broadcast in 3 languages, echoed through the halls. They included a reminder about the upcoming Cultural Heritage Festival, the same event Walsh had once canceled. This year, it would be a week-long celebration with community involvement. During lunch, Sarah sat with a group of freshman students who had started a cultural awareness club. They were planning an event called My Story Matters, inspired by what had happened to her. "You showed us we don't have to be afraid," one girl told her, wearing traditional African prints proudly. News crews still visited occasionally, doing follow-up stories on what they called the Riverside Revolution. The latest headline read, "Former Principal's Actions Lead to Positive Change in Schools Nationwide." Other districts had started adopting Riverside's new policies. Dr. Johnson visited that afternoon to speak at a special assembly about the importance of standing up against discrimination. Looking at her daughter sitting on the stage with other student leaders, she felt tears of pride form in her eyes. Sarah had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change. The Diversity and Inclusion Scholarship, named in Sarah's honor, had already helped 3 students attend college. Applications for the next year had doubled, with essays focusing on how students plan to promote inclusion in their communities. After school, Sarah walked through the halls, remembering how different things had felt 6 months ago. She passed Walsh's old office, now transformed into a student support center where kids could freely discuss their concerns without fear. Outside, she met Emma for their usual walk home. They paused on those same steps where everything had started. "You know what's funny?" Sarah said, looking at the setting sun. "Walsh thought he was going to teach me a lesson that day. Instead, he ended up learning one himself." Emma nodded, thinking about her viral video that started it all. "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest actions," she replied. "All it takes is one person brave enough to stand up, and one friend brave enough to stand with them." As they walked home, they passed other students freely expressing their cultural identities, in their hair, their clothes, their languages. Riverside High had become what it always should have been, a place where every student could be proudly, unapologetically themselves. Sarah's hand shook as she clutched her backpack, walking down Riverside High's main steps. The morning sun felt too bright, making her eyes water. Or maybe those were tears she was fighting back. Principal Walsh's words still rang in her ears, sharp and cruel. "Pack your things. You're suspended until you comply with our appearance standards." Behind her, the heavy school doors slammed shut, the sound echoing like a judge's gavel. Other students passing by slowed down to watch, their whispers creating a soft buzz of shock and sympathy. Sarah had been their classmate since kindergarten, and now she was being forced to leave over her hairstyle. Emma Chen, who had quietly followed her friend out, was still recording everything on her phone. Her hands trembled with anger, but she kept the camera steady, knowing this moment needed to be documented. Through her phone screen, she watched Sarah pull out her cell phone to call her mother. "Mom." Sarah's voice cracked as she spoke into the phone. "He did it. He actually suspended me." She paused, listening to her mother's gasp on the other end. "Yes, right now. He said I can't come back until I change my hair." Principal Walsh watched from his office window, straightening his tie with satisfaction. He didn't notice Emma recording, didn't see the growing crowd of students gathering around Sarah, didn't realize he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. His secretary, Mrs. Martinez, stood in the doorway of his office, her face pale with disbelief. "Sir," she said quietly, "Sarah Johnson's mother is a board member at the Children's Hospital. She's already calling the school board." Walsh just shrugged, still believing he was untouchable. Down on the steps, Sarah's friends had formed a protective circle around her. Jessica, her lab partner since freshman year, offered her water bottle. Marcus, the student body president, was already typing furiously on his phone, alerting their civil rights club advisor. But it was Emma's quiet documentation that would change everything. As Sarah waited for her mother, she sat on the bottom step, trying to maintain her dignity. Students she barely knew came up to offer support. "Your hair is beautiful," said a freshman girl with similar twists. "This isn't right," added a senior boy who had Walsh as a principal for 4 long years. Dr. Patricia Johnson's silver Mercedes screeched into the parking lot 10 minutes later. She emerged looking every bit the accomplished professional she was, in a crisp doctor's coat, having left her hospital rounds the moment Sarah called. Her own hair was styled similarly to her daughter's, a fact that didn't escape anyone's notice. Principal Walsh's voice drifted down from where he now stood at the top of the steps, apparently coming out to defend his decision to the growing crowd. "We have standards here at Riverside High," he announced loudly, his words dripping with authority. "Rules are rules." But as he spoke, Emma's video was already uploading to social media. Her hands flew across her phone screen, adding a simple caption: "Watch our principal suspend a straightest student because of her natural hair." This is Riverside High, 2024. Dr. Johnson wrapped her arm around Sarah's shoulders, facing Walsh with steel in her eyes. "My daughter's hair is professional, clean, and a celebration of her heritage," she declared, her voice carrying across the now silent courtyard. "Your actions today aren't just discriminatory. They're illegal." Students had their phones out now, capturing every moment. The morning bell rang inside the building, but nobody moved. They all sensed they were witnessing something important, a moment when injustice was being caught in broad daylight. As Sarah and her mother walked to their car, Emma's video hit send. Within minutes, it would start appearing on local social media pages. Within hours, it would reach news stations. And by sunset, Principal Walsh would begin to understand just how badly he had miscalculated this situation. The small act of recording that video was about to spark a firestorm that would change Riverside High forever. Emma's video spread like wildfire across social media platforms. By lunchtime, what started as a local school incident had transformed into a national conversation. Students at Riverside High couldn't focus on their lessons as their phones kept buzzing with notifications, watching the view count climb into the thousands, then hundreds of thousands. The video caught everything perfectly. Walsh's condescending tone, Sarah's dignity in the face of humiliation, and most importantly, the clear discrimination behind his actions. Local news stations began calling the school for comment before the lunch bell even rang. The front office staff exchanged worried glances as the phones wouldn't stop ringing. "Have you seen the comments?" whispered Marcus to Emma in their shared history class. Emma nodded, scrolling through her phone under her desk. Civil rights organizations were already sharing the video, adding their own experiences with similar cases. One comment caught her eye. "I was forced to leave this same school 5 years ago. Same principal, same discrimination." That comment opened the floodgates. Former students began sharing their own stories about Principal Walsh in the comments section. Jenny Martinez, class of 2020, wrote about being sent home for wearing traditional Mexican accessories during Hispanic Heritage Month. David Kim recalled being disciplined for speaking Korean to his grandmother when she visited during lunch period. By mid-afternoon, local news vans had parked outside Riverside High. Reporter Maria Santos from Channel 7 News stood on the same steps where Sarah had called her mother just hours earlier. "We're to live outside Riverside High School," she announced into her microphone, where a disturbing video has surfaced showing what appears to be a clear case of racial discrimination. Inside his office, Principal Walsh's confidence began to crack. His secretary had just handed him printouts of emails from the school board, the local NAACP chapter, and 3 different civil rights attorneys. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing with text messages from other district administrators asking for explanations. The story gained even more traction when someone dug up the school's yearbooks from the past decade. A Twitter user posted a thread showing the pattern. Photos of disciplined students revealed a disturbing trend of targeting minorities for dress code violations. The thread went viral within minutes, adding fuel to the already raging fire. Sarah, now at home with her mother, watched everything unfold on her laptop. Dr. Johnson was on the phone with their family lawyer, but she paused to hug her daughter as more support poured in. Celebrities were sharing the video, adding their own messages of support. A famous natural hair care company even reached out, offering to create a scholarship in Sarah's name. Back at school, Emma couldn't believe how quickly everything had escalated. Her simple act of recording had unleashed years of pent-up frustration with Walsh's leadership. Local civil rights leaders announced they would hold a press conference the next morning. The school board called an emergency meeting. The most powerful moment came when a group of Riverside High teachers, led by Mrs. Rodriguez from the English department, released a joint statement. "We have witnessed similar incidents over the years, but feared retaliation if we spoke up. Today, we stand with Sarah and all students who have faced discrimination in our halls." By sunset, national news networks had picked up the story. Walsh sat alone in his office, watching his career crumble on every major news channel. The school district spokesperson had already issued a statement distancing themselves from his actions. "We take these allegations very seriously and are launching a full investigation." Social media users began digging deeper, finding more evidence of Walsh's problematic leadership. A Facebook group called Justice at Riverside gained over 10,000 members in just hours, with former students sharing stories spanning his entire 12-year tenure. As the day drew to a close, Emma received a text from Sarah. "Thank you for being brave enough to record it. For the first time, people are finally seeing the truth." Emma smiled, knowing that tomorrow would bring even bigger changes. The video that started as a simple recording had become a catalyst for long-overdue justice at Riverside High. The school board meeting room had never been so packed. Every seat was taken, people lined the walls, and a crowd spilled out into the hallway. Local news cameras filmed from designated spots, their red lights blinking like tiny warning signals in the tense atmosphere. Dr. Patricia Johnson sat in the front row, Sarah beside her, both dressed in professional attire with their natural hairstyle proudly. Behind them sat hundreds of community members wearing buttons that read, "Stand with Sarah," and "End Discrimination at Riverside." Emma and her family were there too, along with dozens of current and former students who had come to share their stories. "This meeting of the Riverside School Board will come to order," announced Board President Michael Chen, his voice firm but troubled. The usual procedural matters were quickly handled, and then came the moment everyone was waiting for: public comments about Principal Walsh. One by one, people approached the microphone. Mrs. Rodriguez, the English teacher, spoke first. Her voice shook as she described years of watching Walsh target minority students. "I once saw him ignore 3 white students wearing the same hairstyle he suspended Sarah for," she revealed, causing murmurs to ripple through the crowd. A former student, now a college junior, described how Walsh had forced him to remove his cultural headwear. "I felt ashamed of my heritage that day," he said, his mother wiping tears beside him. No student should ever feel that way at school. The testimony that hit hardest came from Jenny Martinez, who had graduated 5 years ago. She had driven 3 hours to attend the meeting. "Principal Walsh told me my quinceanera photos were too ethnic for the yearbook," she said, her voice strong with years of stored anger. "Today I'm a law student, and I can tell you, everything he did was illegal." Then Dr. Johnson stood up to speak. The room fell completely silent. She walked to the microphone, adjusted it slightly, and took a deep breath. Sarah watched her mother, heart swelling with pride. "My daughter," Dr. Johnson began, "excels in every subject. She volunteers at my hospital. She tutors younger students, but none of that mattered to Principal Walsh. All he saw was her hair. The same hair that grows naturally from her head. The same hair I wear proudly as a practicing physician. The same hair that connects us to our heritage and identity." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But this isn't just about hair. This is about power and how it's been abused. This is about the countless students who suffered in silence. This is about every parent who had to explain to their child why they were treated differently." The crowd erupted in applause when she finished. Even some school board members were wiping their eyes. Emma's viral video played on the large screen next, followed by a presentation of documented complaints against Walsh that had been ignored over the years. Community leaders spoke about the broader impact of discrimination in schools. Local civil rights attorney James Wilson outlined the legal violations in Walsh's actions. "This isn't a gray area," he explained. "This is clear-cut discrimination, and it's been happening for years." As the meeting stretched into its 3rd hour, no one left. Students shared stories of being sent home for wearing cultural clothing, of having their names mispronounced deliberately, of feeling unwelcome in their own school. Each story added another brick to the wall of evidence against Walsh. Principal Walsh had been invited to defend himself but chose not to attend. His empty chair at the side of the room spoke volumes. His lawyer had advised against appearing, but everyone knew the real reason. There was no defending the indefensible. The meeting ended with Board President Chen announcing an immediate full investigation into all complaints against Walsh. "What we've heard tonight cannot be ignored," he declared. "Change isn't just coming, it's here." As people filed out of the meeting, Sarah hugged her mother tightly. This wasn't just about getting justice for one incident anymore. It had become a movement for change, a demand for accountability, and a moment of healing for an entire community. The investigation into Principal Walsh's conduct moved faster than anyone expected. In a small conference room at the district office, investigators pored over 12 years of disciplinary records, emails, and student complaints. What they found was worse than anyone imagined. Linda Torres, the lead investigator, spread dozens of files across the table. "Look at these numbers," she said to her team, pointing at a chart. Black students were 4 times more likely to be disciplined for dress code violations. Hispanic students were 3 times more likely to get detention for speaking Spanish in the hallways. The evidence was overwhelming. Former school secretary Maria Gonzalez had kept copies of every discriminatory incident she'd witnessed. She brought in a box filled with dated notes, emails, and photos. "I knew someday someone would need these," she explained, her hands trembling as she handed over years of secret documentation. The investigation uncovered Walsh's private emails, which were even more damaging. In messages to other administrators, he referred to cultural hairstyles as unprofessional distractions and complained about students speaking their native languages, calling it disrespectful to our school culture. Sarah's incident had broken open the dam. Students who had graduated years ago began sending in their written accounts. One email came from James Chen, class of 2016. Principal Walsh told me my traditional Chinese New Year clothing was too distracting. I changed into regular clothes in the bathroom and cried for an hour. The district's legal team worked overtime reviewing the findings. This is a major liability, the head lawyer warned the school board. Every incident is a potential lawsuit. The pattern of discrimination is clear and documented. They discovered that Walsh had been quietly transferring teachers who spoke up against his policies. Mrs. Rodriguez wasn't the first to notice the discrimination. She was just the first who couldn't be silenced. 3 other teachers had been moved to different schools after filing complaints about Walsh's behavior. The investigation team found a particularly disturbing incident from 2 years ago. Walsh had canceled the International Culture Day celebration, claiming it took too much time away from regular studies. The real reason, found in his emails, was that he thought it encouraged division rather than unity. Social media played a crucial role too. After Emma's video went viral, more videos surfaced. Security camera footage showed Walsh confronting students about their appearance, their accents, their cultural expressions. Each clip added another piece to the puzzle. The district's HR department uncovered that Walsh had been reprimanded at his previous school for similar issues, but he had managed to keep it quiet when applying to Riverside High. He should never have been hired here, admitted the current HR director, looking ashamed. Parents began sharing their recorded phone calls with Walsh. In one particularly shocking recording, he told a Nigerian mother that her daughter's traditional head wrap was not appropriate for a serious academic environment. The mother, a university professor, had saved that voicemail for 3 years. The investigation team worked late into each night, their office lit by fluorescent lights as they pieced together the full scope of Walsh's actions. They interviewed current and former staff members, many of whom finally felt safe enough to speak up. It wasn't just the big incidents, explained the school nurse, fighting back tears during her interview. It was the small daily humiliations, the way he'd mispronounce names on purpose, the way he'd make students feel ashamed of their culture, the way he'd smile while doing it all. As the investigation neared its end, the evidence filled multiple boxes and hundreds of digital files. The school board's lawyers prepared their report, knowing it would likely make national headlines again. Walsh's attorney requested a meeting, sensing the coming storm. Linda Torres sat at her desk, reviewing the final report. On her screen was a photo of Sarah Johnson, the student whose strength had finally exposed years of injustice. Sometimes, she thought, it just takes one person standing up to reveal the truth everyone else was afraid to see. The morning of the final school board meeting dawned bright and clear. Local news trucks lined the street, and national media had sent reporters too. Inside the packed auditorium, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Principal Walsh sat with his lawyer, his usual confident smirk replaced by a nervous frown. Board President Chen called the meeting to order at exactly 9 a.m. The investigation team's presentation was projected onto a large screen. Linda Torres stood at the podium, her voice steady as she revealed their findings to the public for the first time. Over 12 years, she began, we found 347 documented cases of discriminatory actions. Minority students were punished at 5 times the rate of other students. Cultural expression was systematically suppressed. Teachers who spoke up were silenced or transferred. Photos and documents flashed across the screen. Walsh shifted uncomfortably in his seat as his own emails appeared, showing his bias in black and white. The crowd gasped at particularly shocking examples. Sarah, sitting with her mother in the front row, held her head high as her case was discussed. But perhaps most disturbing, Linda continued, was the cover-up. Principal Walsh deliberately buried complaints, manipulated records, and created a culture of fear to prevent people from speaking out. Dr. Johnson squeezed Sarah's hand as they watched Walsh's face grow paler with each revelation. The man who had seemed so powerful just weeks ago now looked small and afraid. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but he just shook his head. The district's legal team presented next, explaining the serious legal violations. Each incident represents a potential civil rights violation. The head lawyer explained. The district faces significant liability for allowing this behavior to continue for so long. Walsh's lawyer tried to defend him, claiming his actions were about maintaining professional standards. But his words rang hollow against the mountain of evidence. Even as he spoke, more former students were sharing their stories on social media using #RiversideJustice. The board members asked tough questions, their faces showing growing anger as they understood the full scope of Walsh's actions. How did we miss this for so long? One member asked, her voice shaking. How many students did we fail? Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. Board President Chen stood up, straightening his tie. Based on the investigation's findings and the clear violation of multiple district policies and federal laws, I move to terminate Principal Robert Walsh's contract, effective immediately. The vote was unanimous. As each board member said aye, years of pent-up emotions were released in the room. Some people cried, others hugged, and a few just sat in stunned silence. Walsh's face turned red, then white, as he realized his career was over. But the board wasn't finished. They announced a comprehensive plan to address the damage done. New anti-discrimination policies would be implemented. Cultural sensitivity training would be mandatory. A student-parent advisory committee would be created to review all disciplinary actions. Furthermore, Chen announced, we are establishing the Diversity and Inclusion Scholarship, with Sarah Johnson as its first recipient. Her courage in standing up to injustice has created lasting change in our district. Walsh stormed out of the meeting before it ended, ignoring reporters' questions. His lawyer stayed behind, already preparing for the civil lawsuits that would surely follow. The story made national headlines. Principal's career ends after years of discrimination exposed. As people left the meeting, there was a sense of both justice and sadness. Justice that Walsh was finally held accountable, but sadness for all the students who had suffered under his leadership. Emma's video, still circulating online, had reached over 5 million views. Sarah stood outside with her mother, surrounded by well-wishers and supporters. A group of freshman students asked to take photos with her, calling her their hero. Dr. Johnson watched proudly as her daughter spoke to reporters about the importance of standing up for what's right. Sometimes, Sarah told the cameras, one person's story can help tell everyone's truth. This wasn't just about me or my hair. It was about every student who ever felt they had to hide who they were to fit someone else's idea of professional or appropriate. 6 months had passed since that fateful day when Sarah was sent home for her hair. Riverside High looked different now, not just because of the new Celebrate Diversity mural in the main hallway, but because of the energy that filled its corridors. The new principal, Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, stood greeting students as they arrived for the first day of the new semester. His warm smile and genuine interest in each student marked a dramatic change from Walsh's cold authority. Today was special. It was Sarah's first day back at Riverside High. She walked up the same steps where she had once stood in tears. This time, she wasn't alone. Dozens of students wore their natural hairstyles proudly, some sporting traditional clothing from their cultures. The fear of being singled out had disappeared like morning mist in sunlight. "Welcome back, Sarah," Dr. Rodriguez said, extending his hand. Or should I say, Madam Student Representative. Sarah smiled, touching the silver pin on her lip bulb that marked her new role on the school board. Being the youngest board member in district history wasn't just an honor. It was a responsibility she took seriously. Inside, the changes were everywhere. The old dress code poster had been replaced with a new policy that celebrated cultural expression. Signs in multiple languages welcomed visitors. The trophy case now displayed not just sports achievements, but cultural celebration awards and diversity recognition. Emma, now head of the Student Journalism Club, was recording again, but this time for a documentary about positive change. "Can you believe it's only been 6 months?" she asked Sarah as they walked to first period together. Their friendship had grown stronger through everything that happened. In the teacher's lounge, Mrs. Rodriguez, no longer afraid of speaking up, led a morning discussion about cultural sensitivity in education. Teachers shared ideas for incorporating diverse perspectives into their lessons. The fear that had once silenced them had been replaced by enthusiastic collaboration. Sarah's first task of the day was meeting with the new Student Parent Advisory Committee. The group, created after Walsh's departure, reviewed disciplinary actions to ensure fairness. "Last semester," Sarah reported, "we had 0 complaints about cultural discrimination. That's a first in Riverside's history." The morning announcements, now broadcast in 3 languages, echoed through the halls. They included a reminder about the upcoming Cultural Heritage Festival, the same event Walsh had once canceled. This year, it would be a week-long celebration with community involvement. During lunch, Sarah sat with a group of freshman students who had started a cultural awareness club. They were planning an event called My Story Matters, inspired by what had happened to her. "You showed us we don't have to be afraid," one girl told her, wearing traditional African prints proudly. News crews still visited occasionally, doing follow-up stories on what they called the Riverside Revolution. The latest headline read, "Former principal's actions lead to positive change in schools nationwide." Other districts had started adopting Riverside's new policies. Dr. Johnson visited that afternoon to speak at a special assembly about the importance of standing up against discrimination. Looking at her daughter sitting on the stage with other student leaders, she felt tears of pride form in her eyes. Sarah had turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change. The Diversity and Inclusion Scholarship, named in Sarah's honor, had already helped 3 students attend college. Applications for the next year had doubled, with essays focusing on how students plan to promote inclusion in their communities. After school, Sarah walked through the halls, remembering how different things had felt 6 months ago. She passed Walsh's old office, now transformed into a student support center where kids could freely discuss their concerns without fear. Outside, she met Emma for their usual walk home. They paused on those same steps where everything had started. "You know what's funny?" Sarah said, looking at the setting sun. "Walsh thought he was going to teach me a lesson that day. Instead, he ended up learning one himself." Emma nodded, thinking about her viral video that started it all. "Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest actions," she replied. "All it takes is one person brave enough to stand up, and one friend brave enough to stand with them." As they walked home, they passed other students freely expressing their cultural identities, in their hair, their clothes, their languages. Riverside High had become what it always should have been, a place where every student could be proudly, unapologetically themselves.